Have you ever wondered how a person gets to know the different skill sets to work on power sports, things like snowmobiles, motorcycles, jet skis, things like that? Well, oftentimes they start by working on pieces of equipment like this gas-powered generator. Now, over the next series of videos, we're going to take this apart and get it up and running. This particular generator has seen much better days, and we want to get it back up to a point where it's functional and reliable so that it can be used by someone to power their house in an outage, an electrical outage. So stick around. We're going to have some fun today on Dino's Tinker Shed. So for today's video, I think what we're going to talk about mostly is really looking the machine over, cleaning it, getting it clean enough that we can identify issues that we see right off the bat that need to be addressed. And we'll list those. What do we think actually needs to be repaired on it, just from a visual perspective. Then we have to make up a parts list. What do we think we're going to need? I know right now, just by looking at it, it needs a recoil. It didn't come with one. And sort of work through that list, kind of maybe what do we think we're going to spend on something like that. That'll probably be enough for the first video. Now in subsequent videos, we'll look at things like there's a bit of frame repair on the actual frame itself. We'll get into the system, so the fuel system and the engine's electrical system, to make sure all that's running well. And then we've got to get it running and test the actual 240 volt generator system that's on there, and those can sometimes be tricky. There's things like capacitors and relays in those that can be a little bit challenging. There's breakers, all kinds of stuff. Now again, I'm not an expert, I'm not a mechanic, I'm not an electrician. I mean, I'm an arborist by trade originally, but these are the types of skills that the average homeowner can build just by playing. It's really about the journey with this kind of stuff and learning and understanding how these systems really do work. Okay, let's get started and get this thing clean. So with any project, you need to know what you're dealing with. And in this case, it's an Eastern Tools and Equipment TG7000. And we know that because of this data plate. It gives us a lot of information. Everything from the engine displacement to the RPM to the type of oil it uses. And with any type of project, whether it's a motorcycle or a snowmobile, knowing the model number and the year are really important for ordering parts. And you can see here, this is basically a Honda engine. It's a clone made in China. So we're going to take a look at it and look for things like damage to the battery tray here, anything that looks out of place. Here's a fuel hose that isn't quite right. So the first thing I like to do is go through and do a little bit of a high-level inspection to see things that I know are going to need to be done. So I'm going to take the gas tank off here so that we can see a little bit better underneath. Now, this isn't going to be so much a tutorial on this particular generator, but more about a project. So you have a look here. It looks pretty clean. I go through and check all the mechanisms. You can see there the air pipe from the valve cover is broken. We're going to need a new one of those. And we're going to clean it out and get all the gunk off of this thing. So I usually start with an air hose. I just blow all the loose dirt and debris out from all the nooks and crannies to make sure that when we start to open this thing up, nothing falls down in there. So like around the spark plug or the valve cover here, we don't want that sand and grit falling down into the engine. And you can see I flip it up on its side here and look at how much crap is buried underneath it. Now, after that, I use low pressure from my power washer. I use a 40-degree angle, and I try to avoid any areas where water could penetrate either the generator unit or the power unit itself. And you can see I'm just going to give it a quick rinse here to get all the loose dirt off, and then I'm going to hit it with some engine degreaser. And I do that with just about any project that I start, whether it's a snowmobile or an engine. And again, I try to avoid too much contact on the generator unit, and then I'm going to go through and I'm going to blow dry everything here just so the water doesn't sit on it. So once our washing is done and we have everything dried, we need to do some rudimentary disassembly. I really want to take this and break it into two different components. So I'm going to start by taking off the air box, and look at how dirty it is in here. This is a good indication of how the unit was really maintained, and it gives you some background information into what you're up against with any kind of project. Now you can even see here I'm struggling getting this air box apart because the nut certs that are buried in the plastic have stripped out. I'll have to fix those. So I'll make a little bit of a task list to make sure I get those things done. Now, when you're taking nuts and fasteners apart, you're going to end up with small brackets, things like this. Sometimes I throw the nuts and bolts back into the brackets just so that I can keep track of them. Depending on how deep you go, you can end up with an assortment of different fasteners and things like this bracket here. Now I'm going to start by taking the carburetor off. I know by looking in the tank it was absolutely filthy, which means the carburetor's going to need to be cleaned, and it's probably something that you're going to want to do anyway as part of any kind of restoration project. So as you take it apart, make a note. If you have to, take pictures of how these things come apart. It's really good actually when I videotape things. I can go back and say, how exactly did that one little control arm go in? And you can reference that in the future. Now once we get done here, you're going to see that there's a lot of things and a lot of nuts and bolts. So I have a system where I use disposable baggies. I just go to the dollar store and I write on there what each fastener's for. And you'll see here I only put a couple in that bag. Now once I get the bag filled, I put them into these bins that also come from the dollar store. And items that I know I'm going to replace, like that air tube, I just throw in the box because there's no sense inventorying it. I know it's going to be changed. Same with the spark plug here. And then I make a parts list of things that I know that I'm going to need or that I'm going to replace. And it's important to keep that on track. That's what keeps a project moving forward, is making sure that you get everything organized and in lists and in bags so that when you come back to it, you actually know what you're doing. And sometimes it's good just to put brackets like this right back onto the studs. This way you know how they're oriented, not just where they go. Well, now that we have our system of how we're going to track nuts and bolts and pieces, we can start to actually disassemble your project. So in this case, I know that I'm going to want to pull the power unit out from inside of the frame. Now this could easily be your engine coming out of a motorcycle or a snowmobile, or it could be something like taking apart a small lawn tractor deck. Any kind of project has to have a system. So when I looked this over, I realized that the whole unit is really held in place with 4 nuts sitting on the bottom of the engine on rubber mounts. And the only constraint is I have to take this control panel off. So I could probably go in and take all the wires off, but instead I just took 4 screws out and I laid the entire control panel on the power unit. It makes it easier in the long run for me anyway, because I didn't have to really think about having to rewire the control panel. Now, I'm by myself here. It's a little bit of a struggle, and luckily I have a power pack available to me, so I was able to use a duckbill and pry up underneath the engine and gently tap the studs and then lift the power pack up. And then I just sort of set it back down. The studs sort of held it up. It's not very heavy here. Ultimately, I muscled this thing out, and you can see it's very awkward. If you have a couple people to help you with something like this, it can make a big difference. But you can kind of see now I've got the frame separated from the power pack, and I put the power pack on a small set of wheels and set it aside until I'm ready for it. Okay, that's pretty good. Well, I think that pretty much wraps up the first video in this series. Now, we were able to accomplish quite a few things. Firstly, we were able to get the machine cleaned and get it disassembled into 2 different parts. We have the power pack separated from the frame now, which is great. But we were also able to do an overview of the machine and come up with a sort of a list of tasks that we need to do, and also a parts list, or at least an initial parts list, things we know we're going to need to buy. Now this is important in any project because it keeps it on track, it allows you to have parts when you need them, and it also allows you to budget so you kind of understand what you're getting yourself into. Now for us, I see there's 3 more steps that we're going to probably have to do. Hopefully there won't be anything that we're not seeing. But those steps are pretty clear at this point. So the frame does need some work. So the battery tray was bent pretty badly. We're going to have to straighten and get that fitting properly. And the legs that support the machine were also bent. Probably it was slammed down pretty hard at one point and bent the legs. Those are pretty easy. Now once we get that accomplished, we're going to scrape all the loose paint off of it and we're going to paint it. Now I know that it's powder coated, but I think if we buy one of those newer plastic style paints, it'll adhere good enough for this project. And that's something that's important. You need to understand what you truly want to get out of the project. Is it going to be a museum quality restoration, or is it going to be something like what we're doing? We want to protect the investment moving forward. Now after we get the frame done, we're going to turn our attention to the engine part of the power plant. So we know that the tank is quite dirty, which means the entire fuel system's probably contaminated, and it's a good assumption to make if you don't know the history of a particular item. So we're going to have to clean the tank and flush it, clean the carburetor, put all new fuel lines, new fuel filters, all of that type of work is going to have to be done before we can get this thing even possibly started. Now I also know that it doesn't have a recoil, it never did, so we're going to have to source one, whether it's used or new, and maybe we'll look at both of those and sort of compare the value in that. Now the electric starter is there, but I don't know if it works or not. So we're going to pull that out of the motor and we're going to put it on the bench and test it with a 12 volt system to see if we're into a starter. A new starter is close to $200, so hopefully that's going to work. But moreover, all the wiring that feeds the electric starter has been removed. So we're going to have to make ourselves some new power cables and figure out how that actually goes together and see if the key switch actually works. So we'll probably have to test for continuity, figure out what wires are what. We'll also take a look and do a compression test on the engine to see what type of health the actual machine is in. Now, after that, we'll set the valves to make sure that they're set correctly. I'm pretty sure this unit has a decompression valve in it that's automatic. So hopefully that's going to function as well. Now, if all goes well with that, we'll change the oil, we'll fire it up and get the motor up and running. Lastly, we'll turn our attention to the generator unit on the power pack. Now, I have no idea what kind of condition this is in. We may go through all the work of getting the motor running and then not have any electrical output. Now, I did flip open the control panel and everything looks fairly good in there. The capacitor isn't swollen up or anything like that. But I'm really not super familiar with that. I may need to call in a couple favors if it's not working right. Now, the control panel itself has been pretty rough shape, and I am really not sure what I'm going to do there. I can't find an aftermarket decal for it, so I may just need to clean it up and paint it and try to make it look as best I can. Again, it's really function over form at this point. So that about wraps it up for this video. I've had a really good time, and I hope you have too, watching me take this apart and get it all cleaned. And hopefully you'll stop by in the not too distant future to see the next part of this video series. So until then, I'm Dino. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll see you again soon on Dino's Tinker Shed.